My son called one very ordinary morning and said it bluntly, without any hesitation. "Dad, I've withdrawn all the money from your account. I've also sold the house and the land. I'm getting married. Bye." I didn't scream. I didn't drop the phone. I just stood there in the kitchen, watching the sunlight fall across the old wooden table, and realized that in those few brief seconds, the person I trusted most had taken everything I had spent my entire life building. My name is Henry Wallace. I am 65 years old, retired after nearly 40 years as an industrial electrician, and I once believed that if you worked hard, lived decently, and raised your children with all the love you had, then at the end of your life, you would find peace. I was wrong. My son thought he had taken everything. He didn't know what he'd really just sold. If your child betrayed you in this way, what would you do? Would you suffer in silence, or would you stand up and protect yourself? And if you are listening to this story, tell me what city you are watching from and what time it is, so I know how far the story of this old father has traveled before we go deeper into what really happened. Before everything fell apart, I was just a very ordinary man. No power, no reputation, no secrets worth mentioning. I was 65 years old, retired for 3 years after nearly 4 decades as an industrial electrician. My job was not glamorous. I crawled through machine pits hot as ovens, pulled cables through tight spaces, repaired systems where a single small mistake could shut down an entire factory. I lived by the habit of checking everything twice, working slowly but surely, and believing that if you did your job properly, life would eventually treat you fairly. My wife passed away 8 years ago. Lung cancer. She had never smoked, but life does not always follow logic. After the funeral, the house became too quiet. I did not remarry. Not because I wasn't lonely, but because I no longer had the energy to start over. I learned how to live alone, waking up early, making coffee, reading the printed newspaper, walking around the neighborhood in the afternoon, listening to the radio at night, just to hear a human voice. My life grew smaller, simpler, just enough. My son, Ethan, was the center of all those years. I raised him alone from the age of 12, after his mother died. I worked night shifts so I could take him to school during the day. I turned down jobs far from home so I could be present at parent-teacher meetings. I was not a perfect father, but I was always there. When Ethan graduated from high school, then college, I stood at the back of the auditorium, not clapping too loudly, but inside I was so proud it hurt. I believed I had done the right thing. I believed I had raised a man who could stand on his own 2 feet. We were not the kind of father and son who talked every day. That is normal in America. Ethan had his own life, his own job, his own friends. But when he called, I listened. When he needed me, I showed up. And when he told me he was getting married, that his life was entering a new chapter, I was happy for him in the way a father is when he understands that his child no longer belongs to him. I did not interfere. I did not ask too many questions. I trusted him, not because I was naive, but because I thought that was what a father was supposed to do. Trust his child, until there was a clear reason not to. As for assets, I never saw them as something to boast about. I lived in a 2-story suburban house, not big, not new, but one where I personally fixed every outlet and replaced every board after my wife passed. I owned a few small plots of land bought gradually over the years, not for risky investment, but as a form of security. And I had savings. Not much compared to the wealthy, but enough for me to sleep well at night. I didn't drive a luxury car, I didn't travel far, I didn't live in hardship, but I also never spent money to prove anything to anyone. I never told Ethan the details of my finances, not because I didn't trust him, but because I believed every man should build his own life. I helped when necessary, but I did not shelter him. I did not want my son to grow up feeling that there was always a safety net underneath him, allowing him to take reckless risks. Looking back, perhaps that balance, or some flaw in the way I was a father, is what led us to where we are today. If you are listening to this story and it feels familiar, if you are also a man approaching retirement, living in a modest home, with a child you love but no longer fully understand, then you know that feeling. The feeling of believing your life has settled, that your sacrifices were placed in the right places, and that the future, even if not bright, would at least be peaceful. I believe that too. Before an early morning phone call proved that some things can collapse faster than you imagine, even when you have done everything the right way your entire life. Everything began very small, so small that if I could go back to that moment, I'm still not sure I would do anything differently. Ethan called me one weekday evening after work. His voice was tired but excited, the kind of tiredness you hear in someone who believes he's building a better future. He talked about the upcoming wedding, about work pressure, about how Lily wanted everything to be stable before they officially started their life together. Then, as a minor detail that didn't seem important, he said he was worried about me. "Dad," he said, "do you know how banks work these days? Everything's online. Bill payments, property taxes, insurance. You're still using paper books and cash like it's 20 years ago. I'm just afraid one day you'll forget a payment and then it'll turn into a mess." He said it gently, no lecturing, no commands, just concern. At least that's what I thought at the time. I laughed and told him I was fine, that I had taken care of myself my whole life. Ethan didn't argue. He just added that he didn't want me worrying about small things when I was already at an age where I should be resting. He offered to help me organize my bank accounts, set up automatic payments for fixed bills so I wouldn't have to think about them anymore. "I'll do it for you once," he said. "After that, you won't need to touch it again." I hesitated, not because I distrusted my son, but because I wasn't used to handing that kind of thing over to anyone else. Finances had always been private to me. I was used to signing my own checks, keeping my own records, checking everything myself. But Ethan's reasons were hard to refuse. I wasn't good with technology. That was true. I had once needed a neighbor's help just to download a simple banking app. And Ethan was getting married. He was trying to build his own life, becoming more mature. His wanting to help me sounded like a natural step in a father-son relationship where roles slowly shift. "I don't want to control anything of yours," Ethan added, as if he could read my thoughts. "I just want to help make things easier. If you're not comfortable, we don't have to do it." Strangely enough, that sentence made me feel more at ease. It gave me the right to refuse. And because of that, I didn't. We agreed to meet on the weekend. Ethan brought his laptop and sat at the dining table where I used to help him with homework when he was a child. He logged into my bank account and explained each step, each section. I looked at the familiar numbers on the screen and felt a slight discomfort seeing them in someone else's hands, even though that person was my son. Ethan spoke quickly and confidently, like someone who had done this hundreds of times. He set up automatic payments for electricity, water, insurance. Everything made sense. There were no strange transactions, no unusual requests. Then came the final step. He said that to make everything run smoothly, he needed full access, at least in the beginning, in case something went wrong. "I won't touch your money," he said, almost smiling. "I'm just the guy behind the screen in case something happens." I looked at him, at the familiar face I had watched grow up day by day, and I nodded. The moment I read the verification code sent to my phone and typed it into the computer for Ethan, I didn't feel like I was making a mistake. It didn't feel like a big decision. It felt like a small chore, a minor convenience. I didn't lose any money. I didn't sign papers to sell a house. I just gave my son a door, believing he would stand at the threshold and not step any further inside. After that day, my life continued as usual. Bills were paid on time. Nothing went wrong. Ethan called occasionally, asked if I needed anything, talked about wedding plans. I felt I had done the right thing. I felt I had helped my son, and my son had helped me. A fair, reasonable exchange. Exactly how things were supposed to work. But there are things you only realize later, small signs you ignore because if you stop to question them, you would have to question your own feelings. I remember once Ethan asked if I still had the land ownership papers for the plot behind the house, saying the bank sometimes needed to verify information. I answered casually. I remember Lily mentioning optimizing assets during dinner, and I didn't pay attention. Everything sounded reasonable, normal, easy to accept. Trusting your child never feels like a risk, until it is. At the time, I didn't see myself as gambling. I only saw myself doing what a father at my age was expected to do. And precisely because everything was so reasonable to refuse, I didn't see the path I was stepping onto. Not a path toward convenience, but one that would eventually force me to ask whether there were boundaries I had failed to draw, and what the true cost of unconditional trust really was. I met Lily for the first time on a Sunday afternoon. Ethan said he wanted to bring her over for dinner, so you two can get acquainted. The way he said it sounded like a small formality, but I knew that for my son, it was an important step. I cleaned the house more carefully than usual, not to impress her, but because I wanted everything to look exactly like who I had always been. Neat, unpretentious, nothing hidden. Lily arrived right on time. She was younger than I expected, in her early 20s, slender, dressed elegantly, but not simply. Everything about her fit just right, from her hair to her smile, as if it had all been calculated in advance. When she shook my hand, her eyes paused briefly on my face, then slid past me, taking in the house behind my back with undisguised curiosity. Not the curiosity of someone visiting another person's home for the first time, but the kind that evaluates. During dinner, Lily talked a lot. She was intelligent, articulate, speaking about her job, about travel plans after the wedding, about how the two of them were thinking about the long term. Ethan sat beside her, smiling, occasionally placing his hand over hers as if to confirm that. I listened more than I spoke. I had long learned to observe people through the words they chose. "This house must be worth a lot," Lily said in the middle of the meal, her tone light, as if it were just an offhand remark. "Homes in this area are rare now. Land prices have gone up so much." I looked up at her. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were sweeping across the living room, pausing at the staircase, then at the window facing the backyard, as if she were drawing a map in her head. "This is where I live," I said simply. "I've never thought about selling." Lily turned back to me and smiled. "I'm just saying. The future, you know. Maybe one day you'll want to downsize. Live a little lighter." She emphasized the word future very skillfully, as if it were something obvious, already decided. Ethan laughed a little too quickly. "Lily thinks far ahead," he said. "Don't mind her, Dad. She just likes talking about real estate." After saying that, he glanced at Lily, his eyes asking her to stop there. Lily shrugged, took a sip of wine, and didn't argue. But I noticed one thing. She didn't apologize. She didn't say she had spoken out of turn. She simply moved on, as if the question had been perfectly normal. After dinner, while Ethan helped me clear the table, Lily walked around the house. She didn't ask for permission. She just moved slowly, touching the bookshelf, looking at the family photos on the wall. When she stopped in front of the photo of Ethan and me on his college graduation day, she tilted her head and smiled. "Ethan really takes after you," she said. "I think later on, when everything is ours, he'll take just as good care of things as you do." She spoke very naturally, using the word ours as if it were already agreed upon. I didn't react. I didn't correct her words. I just took note. There are things that, if you rush to label someone as a villain, only make you look bitter yourself. I didn't want to be the difficult father, suspicious of everything connected to my son. I had promised myself that I would let Ethan choose his own life. And Lily, even with the questions that made me uncomfortable, was still just my son's fiancée, at least at that time. Before they left, Lily looked at me again. Her gaze was sharp and quick, as if measuring distance. "I'm very glad Ethan has such a solid father," she said. "With a foundation like this, we'll feel more secure building our future." Again. "We." Again, foundation. Ethan nodded, holding her hand, seemingly unaware of anything unusual. When the door closed, I stood alone in the living room, listening to the sound of their car driving away. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel afraid either. Just a vague, hard-to-name sensation, like hearing a strange noise in your house at midnight and telling yourself it's probably just the wind. You don't turn on the lights. You go back to bed. But your sleep is no longer as deep as before. I didn't say anything to Ethan about Lily, not because I hadn't noticed anything, but because I had noticed too much to reach a conclusion right away. Her eyes, the way she asked about the value of the house and land, the way she said "we" when referring to things that had never been hers. None of it was enough to accuse, but it was enough for me to remember. And sometimes the signs that are too small to react to immediately are exactly what end up costing people the most later on. That morning began exactly like every other morning. I woke up at 5:30, following a habit ingrained over decades of early shifts. It was still dark, the air so quiet, I could clearly hear the refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. I made coffee, opened the back door to let some cold air in, then sat down at the dining table with the tablet Ethan had helped me install the banking app on a few months earlier. I had no bad feeling. I was just going to check and be done with it, like a new habit I was still getting used to. The screen loaded more slowly than usual. I typed in my password, waited for the verification code, then tapped on my savings account. When the number appeared, I thought I was seeing it wrong. I blinked, looked again, then raised a hand to rub my forehead, as if the kitchen light wasn't bright enough. The balance was wrong. Not just lower, it was almost empty. I switched to the checking account. The number there was no better. The money I remembered clearly, every dollar, every year of work, every time I chose not to buy something I wanted, was gone. I didn't jump up. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there staring at the screen, waiting for the sense of confusion to pass, as if this were only a temporary system error. I logged out and logged back in. I checked the dates, making sure I wasn't misreading the columns. But the numbers didn't change. They sat there, cold and indifferent, like a truth that didn't care whether I was ready to accept it or not. I called the bank. After a few minutes on hold, a young female voice answered. She read my name, confirmed my information, then asked how she could help. I spoke slowly and carefully, as if speaking any faster might cause everything to shatter. I told her the account balances were incorrect, that I thought there might be a mistake. She typed on her keyboard, was silent for a moment, then said she was reviewing the transaction history. "Sir," she said, her tone still very professional, "all of these transactions have been verified as valid. Access was granted from your primary account. All transfers were approved." She paused briefly, then asked, "Have you authorized anyone else to manage your account?" I knew the answer was yes. I also knew that answer would change everything. I said Ethan's name. She confirmed. All transactions led to an account in my son's name and a few other linked accounts she could not provide details on over the phone. I thanked her and hung up. I placed the phone back on the table in its usual spot, as if preserving order could keep the world from collapsing any further. The coffee pot had gone cold at some point. I didn't bother reheating it. I sat there. 10 minutes. Then 20. Then an hour. The light outside the window slowly shifted from gray to pale gold, signaling that half the morning had passed. I didn't move. I couldn't form a clear thought. There was only a vast emptiness in my head, where every idea collided with another and dissolved. I didn't cry. I didn't feel tears. Maybe my body hadn't caught up with what was happening yet. Or maybe I had lived long enough to know that some of the biggest shocks don't arrive with intense emotion, but with numbness. I looked around the familiar kitchen, the objects that had been there for years, and wondered whether they still belonged to me. Whether everything I thought was certain had truly been certain, or just an unspoken agreement whose terms I had never read carefully. In that long stretch of silence, only one question kept repeating itself. Not loudly, not angrily, but clinging to me like a thorn. Was this a mistake or a choice? Was I witnessing an error, a chain of misunderstandings that would be corrected once I spoke to my son? Or was I facing a deliberate decision, carefully considered and carried out by the very person I trusted most? I didn't have an answer that morning. I only knew that an invisible boundary had just been crossed, and whether this was a mistake or a choice, from the moment those numbers disappeared, the stable life I thought I had already built was gone. I was not the one who called first. I didn't have the energy to pick up the phone and ask Ethan something I already sensed I didn't want to hear. I let the entire morning pass in silence, sitting in the kitchen, then moving to the sofa in the living room, where the sunlight revealed every scratch on the wooden floor. I checked the clock a few times, not because I was hoping he would call, but because I wanted to know how long I had been sitting there doing nothing. Near noon, the phone vibrated. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately, without thinking any further. "Dad," he said, sounding relieved, even slightly excited. "I was going to call you earlier, but this morning has been crazy busy." I didn't respond right away. I waited. He continued as if I were smiling on the other end of the line. "I have good news. Lily and I decided not to wait anymore. We're getting married this weekend. Everything's already set." He spoke quickly, his sentences running together, not leaving me any space to interrupt. I asked only one question. "Ethan, the money in my account." I kept my voice normal, not raised, not lowered. There was a very brief pause, just long enough for me to know that the question didn't surprise him. "Oh, that," he said, then gave a small laugh. "I withdrew it, Dad. I needed the money for a down payment on the new house. And besides, I don't think you need that much anyway. You live simply." I didn't interrupt. I let him keep talking. "Oh, and one more thing," Ethan added, as if he had just remembered a small detail. "I sold the house and the land behind it. Got a really good price. The market's up. I didn't want to miss the opportunity." The way he said it caught my attention more than the content itself. There was no hesitation, no sense that he was delivering bad news. He spoke as if he were explaining a reasonable, even smart decision. "When did you sell it?" I asked. That was my second question, and also my last. Last week. The paperwork's all done. You signed those documents already, remember? I remembered. I remembered very clearly the papers Ethan had brought me to sign at the hospital when I had severe pneumonia last year, my head foggy from medication. At the time, I hadn't asked. I had trusted him. Now that memory came back, sharp and painfully clear. You have 30 days to move out, Ethan continued, his voice still steady. I know it sounds rushed, but we need to settle in quickly too. You can stay with us temporarily for a while, and then we'll figure things out. The phrase, stay temporarily, was spoken very lightly, like a favor, as if that house had never really been mine. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I didn't say that was my lifetime of savings. I didn't mention his mother or the years I had sacrificed. I stayed silent, letting my son's voice fill the space. On the other end of the line, I could hear people talking, papers rustling, someone calling his name. His life was moving on, busy, important. I have to go, Ethan said hurriedly. Someone's waiting. We'll talk later, Dad. Don't worry too much. Everything's fine. And then he hung up before I could say anything else. I put the phone down very slowly, as if moving faster might cause something to shatter. I looked around the room at every familiar object, every corner I had lived in for so many years. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was a cold clarity, like listening to a doctor read test results when there's no hope left to cling to. The missing numbers were not a mistake. They hadn't slipped away on their own. They had been taken, deliberately, by the very person I had given the power to do so. What hurt me most wasn't the money, and it wasn't the house. It was the way Ethan spoke. The ease, the certainty that he had the right to decide for me. No asking, no waiting, no sense that permission was even required. In that voice, I heard something deeply dangerous. Not malice, but entitlement. The belief that what I had would eventually be his anyway, so taking it sooner or later was merely a matter of timing. I sat down in the chair, my back straight, my hands resting on my thighs, and let out a long breath. There are moments in life when you know you've passed through a door you can never walk back through. That phone call was mine. Not because I lost money or a house, but because I understood that the father-son relationship I believed was solid had changed its very nature. From the moment Ethan hung up, I knew that no matter what happened next, I would never again be able to pretend this was just a misunderstanding. This was the point of no return. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time, not because I was trying to hold back anger, but because I was listening to a very strange feeling rising in my chest. It wasn't panic. It wasn't despair either. It was a cold, clear stillness, so sharp that it surprised me. And then, from somewhere, a laugh slipped out of my throat. Not loud, not joyful, just a soft, brief laugh, almost soundless. I raised a hand to cover my mouth, as if afraid of hearing myself, not because I found it funny that my son had just taken everything from me, but because I had just realized something very simple. Ethan thought he had sold the house I was living in, but he hadn't. I stood up and walked slowly into the small study at the back of the house. It was a room few people paid attention to, even Ethan. In the corner was an old filing cabinet, its paint chipped, the lock making a familiar sound when I opened it. I wasn't in a hurry. I knew exactly what I was looking for. The folders were neatly arranged, labeled in my own handwriting, the habit of a man who had lived his entire life by doing things properly and thoroughly. The piece of land Ethan said he had sold, the plot behind the house, was not a clean asset. I had held the title for more than 15 years, but only on paper. It was tied up in a long-standing dispute with relatives from my ex-wife's side of the family. It had never been eligible for transfer. It had never been legally allowed to be sold. I had kept it not for its value, but waiting for the day everything would be resolved clearly. Ethan didn't know that. He had never asked, and I had never felt the need to explain. As for the house I was living in, I leaned back against the desk and let out a long breath as I thought about it. After my wife passed away, I had transferred ownership of the house into a family trust, not to avoid taxes, not to hide anything, just a cautious decision, suggested by a lawyer, to protect the asset in case I ever lost clarity or something unexpected happened. I was the beneficiary. I was the trustee. But on paper, the house had not been in my personal name for many years. Ethan had no idea, not because I deliberately hid it, but because throughout those years he had never cared about the details. He saw me living there. He naturally assumed the house was mine, in the simplest sense. And when he decided to sell it, He hadn't sold what he thought he had. He had only sold what he believed existed. I didn't feel relief right away. I didn't feel victorious either. I just saw more clearly. Clear that I wasn't a powerless old man who had just been completely stripped of everything. Clear that this story was far more complicated than a greedy son taking money from his father. And clear that, although I had lost a great deal, I hadn't lost everything. I sat down, holding the folder in my hands, and thought, not to plan revenge, not to prove that I was smarter than my son. I had no need for that. I was simply adjusting the image of myself in this story. I was no longer a naive victim, but I wasn't a manipulator pulling strings behind the scenes either. I was a man who had quietly prepared for old age, and now that very preparation had unintentionally created a turning point. What sent a chill down my spine wasn't that Ethan had sold the wrong things. It was the reason he didn't know. He didn't know because he had never truly cared about what I had built, what I had protected. He only saw the surface. He only saw numbers and walls. And when he decided to take, he took with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the whole story. My son didn't know who he was stealing from, not in the sense that I was stronger than him, but in the sense that he had never truly known who I was, how I had lived, or how I had prepared for the later years of my life. Realizing that didn't make me feel triumphant. It only made me understand that from this point on, nothing would be as simple as money or paperwork anymore. And that very ignorance on Ethan's part had opened a new door, not to my safety, but to truths that neither of us was ready to face. After realizing that Ethan had sold the wrong things, the things he thought were everything, I didn't feel relief in the way people usually imagine. The truth was, the money was still gone. And even if the house I was sitting in was still safe, that money was what would determine how I lived in the years I had left. I understood that if I wanted to know where I truly stood, I had to look straight at the numbers, not my emotions. I went back to the dining table, opened my laptop, and logged into my bank account again. This time I wasn't looking for a mistake. I was looking for a trail. I downloaded all the statements from the past 6 months, printed out every page, and laid them out in small stacks. An old habit from my working days. When a system fails, you don't look at the final outcome. You trace every wire. The initial withdrawals looked very by the book. Split up. No single withdrawal large enough to draw attention. A few internal transfers, a few payments labeled deposit, fees, investment setup. Ethan hadn't emptied the account in one sweep. He had done it the way someone does when they believe they're acting reasonably. I looked at the dates. Most of the transactions increased in frequency over the past 6 weeks. They lined up perfectly with the time Ethan said the wedding had started to become more expensive than expected. Then I saw Lily's name. Not right away. At first, there were only transfers to an unfamiliar account, marked with vague descriptions. But when I dug deeper, I found the account holder's name, Lily Thompson, my son's fiancée. The amounts weren't small. And more importantly, they weren't tied to any service or contract I could recognize, just money, moving directly from my account to hers. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. This had crossed the line of helping, but the story didn't end there. As I continued reviewing the statements, another name appeared, Jason Reed. I had never heard that name in any of my paperwork, but when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Transfers to Jason's account often happened just a few hours after money was sent to Lily's account, as if there were a schedule, as if someone were coordinating the flow of money, not someone panicking over an upcoming wedding. I began to piece things together, the wedding pressure Ethan had talked about, the evenings he called me, complaining that Lily wanted a ceremony that was on par, that everyone around her had nicer homes, better cars. The times Lily mentioned short-term investments, capital rotation, making money work instead of sitting still. Back then, I thought it was just youthful ambition. Now, looking at the statements, those words took on a much clearer shape. I searched for the name Jason Reed. It wasn't difficult. Social media was still there. Jason was Lily's ex-boyfriend, a relationship that had ended amicably. According to what Ethan had once mentioned casually, Jason worked as a freelance investment broker, no clear license, no fixed company, just posts showing an easy lifestyle, trips, and hollow quotes about financial freedom. And now, his account was the final destination of my money. In that moment, something important became clear. Ethan was not the one behind this entire plan. He didn't have the patience, nor the sophistication. He acted like someone backed into a corner, believing he was doing what was necessary for a shared future. His decisions bore the marks of haste, not long-term calculation. The money flow, on the other hand, carried the signature of a script that had been thought out in advance. I didn't feel relieved by that realization. In fact, the feeling was more complicated. Part of me wanted to believe my son had been used, that he wasn't the cold mastermind. But another part understood very clearly that being used doesn't equal being innocent. Ethan had opened the door. He had signed the papers. He had taken my money before it flowed into someone else's hands. I sat there for a long time looking at the pages spread across the table. No music, no television, just the steady ticking of the wall clock. I no longer saw Ethan as an enemy, but I also couldn't see him as a complete victim. He was a grown man who had made bad choices under the influence of people who knew exactly what they were doing. And in that moment, I knew this story wouldn't end with me confronting my son. Another truth was waiting to be exposed. I didn't yet know where it would lead, but I knew one thing. To understand what had really happened, I couldn't look only at what Ethan had done. I had to look at the people around him. The ones whispering in his ear, showing him how to take money faster than his ability to understand the consequences of his own actions. I looked at the clock on the wall, nearly 11 at night. I had been sitting with that pile of paperwork all day, without dinner, without turning on the lights, until the room was lit only by the dim glow of the desk lamp. I knew I couldn't delay this call any longer, not because I needed answers. I already had them, but because some truths, no matter how painful, still need to be spoken out loud. I called Ethan. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His voice sounded different, hoarse, low, as if he hadn't slept for several nights. "Dad?" he said hesitantly. I didn't go around in circles. "Ethan," I said, "I've reviewed the statements. I know where the money went." On the other end of the line, there was no immediate reaction, just a long silence, long enough for me to hear his breathing turn rapid and uneven. "Dad, Ethan stopped. Then his voice broke, not a restrained sob, but a sharp, uncontrolled breath. "I have nothing left, Dad." He spoke quickly, as if afraid that if he slowed down, he wouldn't be able to speak at all. "Lily told me to sign the papers. She said it was just an intermediary account, a short-term investment. Jason would handle the technical side. I trusted them. I thought we could cycle the money back in a few weeks." He let out a dry laugh. "This morning I woke up and the account was empty. Lily won't answer her phone. Her apartment is locked. Jason's gone too." I closed my eyes. I had known this was coming, but hearing my own son say it, in the voice of someone who had just lost everything, felt different. Ethan was no longer trying to sound confident. He wasn't talking about the future anymore. He was clinging to that phone call like a final lifeline. "What have you done?" I asked. Not to accuse him, just to understand. "Have you called anyone yet?" He was silent for a few seconds. "I don't dare call anyone," he said. "I'm ashamed. I was so stupid. I thought I was smarter than this. I thought I was doing the right thing for us." His voice began to shake. "I took your money, and now I don't know how to give it back." Then Ethan cried, not the crying of a child seeking pity, but the crying of a man who has just realized he has destroyed everything he believed he was building. I could hear the difficulty in his breathing, hear both bitterness and fear in every breath. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't hear entitlement in my son's voice, only emptiness. I didn't speak right away. I let him cry. I let silence do its work. In my mind, 2 paths appeared with absolute clarity. I could hang up. I could let Ethan face the consequences alone. He was an adult. He had made his choices. The other path was harder. I could help him, not by erasing the consequences, but by stopping him from falling deeper into a place where shame and despair could destroy him entirely. But if I did that, I would also have to face the hardest question of all. Was I saving my son, or was I continuing to shield him from the consequences of his own mistakes? "Ethan," I said after a long while, my voice calmer than I expected, "you were wrong. You know that. I can't pretend this didn't happen." On the other end, his crying slowed. He was listening. "But you're still my son." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I won't promise to save you from every consequence, but I also won't turn my back on you when you're falling apart." I heard a very soft exhale, as if he had relaxed just a little. "Dad, I don't deserve that," Ethan said. I looked out the window where the streetlight shone on an empty sidewalk. Maybe not, I replied, but this isn't about whether you deserve it. It's about what you're going to do next. When the call ended, I set the phone down and sat in the darkness. I knew I had just crossed another boundary. I hadn't saved anyone yet. I had only chosen not to abandon him. And that choice, I understood very clearly, would bring consequences that neither Ethan nor I could fully foresee. But in that moment, between two painful options, I chose the one that left room for a chance. Not for money, but for a father-son relationship standing on the edge of collapse. The next morning, Ethan came to my house. Without warning, I heard a car stop on the street. A car door slam harder than necessary. When I opened the door, I saw my son standing there, shoulders slumped, eyes red, clothes wrinkled as if he had slept in them for several nights. Gone was the look of a man about to be married. All that remained was someone stripped of every illusion. We sat across from each other at the dining table. No coffee, no long greetings. I didn't need more apologies from him. I needed understanding. "Tell me from the beginning," I said. Ethan took a deep breath, clasping his hands together to keep them from shaking. He told me about Lily, about how she had entered his life very quickly, very naturally, about how she always said exactly what he wanted to hear, that he deserved more, that he shouldn't live small like his father, that money sitting still was dead money. At first, it was just words. Then came suggestions, late-night conversations where Lily talked about Jason, an old friend who understood the market very well and had helped her rotate capital before. Ethan said Lily never called Jason an ex-boyfriend in front of him, just an acquaintance, an advisor, a convenient connection. Jason appeared at exactly the right time. Not many face-to-face meetings, mostly through calls, emails, messages. Jason spoke smoothly, using terms that sounded professional but not overly complex. Asset restructuring, intermediary accounts, short-term investments. Those phrases were repeated until they became familiar. Ethan admitted he didn't fully understand them, but he trusted them. Trusted them because Lily trusted them. Trusted them because everyone said that before a wedding, a man needed to prove he could provide for his family. The plan didn't happen overnight. It was built step by step. First came a sense of urgency. The wedding needed to be bigger. The new house needed to be nicer. Everything needed money, and it needed it fast. Then came making it reasonable to take money from me. Lily said I was old, that I didn't need that much money anymore, that in the end, everything would belong to Ethan anyway. They didn't call it stealing. They called it borrowing from the future. I listened without interrupting. Each detail Ethan added made the picture clearer and more unsettling. This wasn't a clumsy robbery. This was emotional manipulation designed to target very specific vulnerabilities: the fear of not being good enough in a young man, the pressure to succeed, and the father-son relationship that I had always believed was strong enough not to require defenses. Ethan looked at me, his eyes full of worry. "I know I was wrong," he said. "I know I shouldn't have taken your money, but I didn't think it would go this far. I thought I was in control." He gave a sad smile. "I didn't realize when I lost control. I understood that, not because I wanted to excuse my son, but because I had seen enough men fall into the same trap. Not bad men, not evil men, just men who were guided step by step to a place where they could no longer tell which decisions were truly theirs and which ones had been planted in their minds long before." Ethan had made a serious mistake. He had crossed a line. He had taken what wasn't his and hurt the person who trusted him. That couldn't be erased just because he was also a victim. But at the same time, I couldn't see him as a complete villain either. I saw a man who had been exploited by the very people he trusted most, in much the same way I had once trusted him. He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't evil either. Realizing that didn't make things easier. It only made the story more complicated and made the choice ahead of me far heavier. Because when the one who causes harm is also the one who is harmed, the line between justice and compassion blurs. And whatever decision I make next will shape not only Ethan's fate, but the kind of man I will be for the rest of my life. I didn't make a decision that day. After Ethan finished telling his story, the kitchen fell silent again. No more tears, no more excuses, just two men sitting across from each other, each carrying his own share of responsibility. I stood up, poured myself a glass of water, drank it slowly, as if buying myself time so I wouldn't say something I'd later regret. "You're not going to like what I'm about to say," I began, my voice steady and low. Ethan looked up and nodded. He was bracing himself. "But if you want any chance at fixing this, everything will happen my way. No negotiation." The first thing I made absolutely clear: I would not cover for him. Not with the bank. Not with the law. Not with anyone. Ethan had taken my money without permission, and even though part of it had been stolen by others, the initial act was still his. "You will face the consequences," I said. "I won't make calls to beg for favors. I won't sign fake guarantees. I won't tell a different story to make things easier for you." Ethan lowered his head. I saw his shoulders tremble slightly, but he didn't argue. Maybe for the first time, he understood this wasn't a moment to be shielded. The second thing, I would help, but help didn't mean carrying the burden for him. I told him I would contact my lawyer, the one who had handled financial fraud cases before. We would sue Lily and Jason, not for revenge, but to stop them from doing this to someone else. I would provide the records, the statements, everything I had. I would be the named plaintiff, because most of the stolen money was mine. But Ethan would also have to step forward as a witness, sign uncomfortable statements, and admit his role in the entire process. "You will have to tell the truth," I emphasized, "even if that truth makes you look bad." Then I said the hardest thing. "You won't live here," I said, looking him straight in the eye. Ethan froze. I knew he had hoped for the opposite. "Not because I hate you, but because if you stay, you'll never force yourself to stand on your own, and I'll never stop being your safety net." I explained that I wouldn't let my son slide from one form of dependence into another. If he wanted to start over, he had to do it as a grown man, not as a child who had just caused a massive mess. Ethan asked quietly, "So where do I go?" I said I didn't know. He would have to figure it out himself. Friends, a cheap rented room, a temporary job. "You'll have to learn to live with what you have left," I said, "not what you think you deserve." I saw a flash of fear in his eyes, but I didn't take it back. Some lessons can't be taught with words. "I'm giving you one chance," I continued slowly. "Just one. Not to avoid pain, but to learn how to endure it without running away. If you cooperate with the lawyer, if you tell the truth, if you work to repay what can be repaid, then I'll stand behind you, not shielding you, but not abandoning you either." I paused. "If you lie, if you try to shift blame onto others, or if you expect me to clean up the consequences for you, then this conversation ends here." Ethan didn't respond right away. He sat there for a long time, his hands clenched until they turned white. Then he nodded, not the nod of relief, but the nod of someone accepting a path far harder than being rescued. "I understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know if I can do it, but I'll try." I looked at my son, and for the first time since everything began, I didn't see him as a betrayer, and I didn't see him as a victim either. I saw a man standing before the first real choice of his life, a choice between continuing to hide behind others or stepping forward and taking responsibility, even if the price would be very high. When Ethan stood up to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back to look at me. "Thank you, Dad," he said, "not for money, not for protection, but for not turning love into an excuse to avoid responsibility." The door closed, and I stood alone in the quiet house. I knew I had just drawn boundaries that could cost me my son forever, but I also knew that if I hadn't, I would have lost both him and myself. That wasn't easy forgiveness. It was a conditional chance. And in the culture I grew up in, that was the only way a man could be given a second chance and still be forced to learn how to take responsibility for what he had done. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in parts, slowly, steadily, like small waves repeatedly hitting the shore, enough to erode whatever illusions still remained. In the first week after that conversation, I contacted my lawyer, not to look for a way out, but to do everything by the book. A case file was opened. Statements were submitted. The money trail was traced. The names Lily and Jason were no longer vague shadows on paper. They became official targets in a civil lawsuit for financial fraud. Ethan had to sign his first sworn statement on a rainy afternoon. I didn't go into the lawyer's office with him. I sat in the hallway reading an old newspaper, letting him walk in on his own. When he came out, his face was visibly pale. "I had to sign everything," he said quietly. "All of it. Even the part where I took your money." I nodded. No comfort, no praise, just the acknowledgement that this was the price of telling the truth. The news spread faster than I expected, not in major headlines, but enough for the small professional circle where Ethan worked to find out. In his field, reputation was everything, and just a few whispers about involvement in fraud, whether as a victim or an accomplice, were enough to make the calls stop coming. Ethan lost his job within 2 weeks. No one said it outright. They just said, "We're restructuring. We need to pause our collaboration." He brought his belongings home in a cardboard box, set it down on the floor of the temporary room he had just rented, and sat there for a long time. Friends disappeared too. No arguments. No public breakups. Just silence. Messages went unanswered. Gatherings he used to be invited to no longer included his name. Some people were afraid of trouble. Some were afraid of being associated. Some simply didn't want to stand next to someone who had failed in that way. Ethan called me one night and said he had never realized how loud other people's silence could be. The lawsuit dragged on. Lily and Jason didn't appear right away. They hired lawyers. They denied everything. They delayed. Every meeting with the lawyers forced Ethan to revisit his own foolish decisions. Every signature, every nod of agreement he had given without thinking through the consequences. I saw him grow thinner. Not from lack of food, but because for the first time in his life, he had nothing to lean on but himself. There were nights when Ethan called me, not to ask for money, not to ask for advice, just to say that he had submitted another set of documents that day, worked an extra shift at his temporary job, been rejected from yet another interview. I listened. I didn't fix anything. I didn't soften reality. I just listened and sometimes said a single short sentence, "Keep going." Not because I was cold, but because I knew that if I turned this pain into something he could avoid, it would return in another form. Ethan began to understand that there were no shortcuts. No apology was enough to instantly restore a reputation. No relationship survived on past credit alone. Everything had to be rebuilt from zero, and it might never return to what it once was. That wasn't a tragedy. It was reality. And that reality, however harsh, was the only thing capable of teaching my son what I hadn't taught early enough, that choices have a cost. I wasn't happy to see my son pay that price, but I didn't turn away either. I stood at just enough distance so he wouldn't fall, but not close enough to lift him back up. I know some people would say I was too harsh, but I also knew that if I intervened further, if I used my age and my role as his father to soften the consequences, I would be sending a very dangerous message. That you can break everything, as long as you apologize long enough. Watching Ethan face that reality day by day, I saw something change, slowly, but genuinely. He stopped talking about what he should have had. He started talking about what he could do. And to me, that wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest beginning. A beginning that could only happen when consequences were fully accepted, not softened by pity, even from the person who had given him a second chance. Time doesn't heal everything the way people like to say it does. It doesn't erase memories. It doesn't make mistakes disappear. But it creates just enough distance so that pain is no longer the only thing you see when you open your eyes each morning. For Ethan and me, time passed in that way, quietly, without drama, no explosive moments, just days following one another, slow and heavy but no longer panicked. For the first 3 months, we barely saw each other, not out of anger, but because each of us needed space to stand upright again. Ethan took on all kinds of temporary jobs, delivery work, warehouse shifts, construction assistants, jobs he never imagined doing after graduating from college. He didn't complain much. When he talked about it, his voice was tired but not bitter. I listened and asked only very short questions. "Are you okay? Do you have enough to eat?" We didn't talk about money. We didn't talk about Lily. We didn't talk about the lawsuit. We only talked about what was happening right in front of us. Then one day, Ethan asked if I wanted to go for a walk with him. A simple question. I said yes. We met at the park near my house, where I walk every afternoon. The air was cool. Leaves were starting to change color. We walked side by side. No rush, not looking at each other much. There were no deep, movie-style conversations, just scattered remarks about the weather, about someone's dog pulling on its leash, about a newly built house in the neighborhood. Those walks became a habit, not regular, no fixed schedule, but frequent enough to form a new rhythm in our relationship. Ethan no longer tried to explain or justify the past. He didn't ask whether I had forgiven him yet. He just showed up, on time, walked with me, and went home. That presence, quiet and without demand, slowly began to matter. I started to notice small changes. The way he said, "I'll handle it myself," instead of, "Can you help me?" The way he stopped spending money on unnecessary things. The way he asked for my opinion on very practical matters, not to have me decide for him, but to hear another perspective. Ethan's maturity didn't arrive in grand declarations. It arrived in small, ordinary details that you could easily miss if you weren't paying attention. One time while we were walking, Ethan said, almost to himself, "I don't think I ever really understood how you lived before." I didn't answer right away. I let the words hang between us. Then I said, "I never really told you everything either." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't an accusation. Just a fact, placed there without needing further explanation. The lawsuit moved slowly. At times, it felt like it was going nowhere. I didn't update Ethan on every detail, not to hide anything, but because I wanted him focused on rebuilding his life, not waiting for a verdict to feel rescued. I realized that healing doesn't come from someone returning your money. It comes from learning how to live with what you've lost, without letting it define you. A year passed. Ethan looked different, not just thinner, but his eyes no longer chased distant things. He looked at what was right in front of him. He didn't talk much about the future. He talked about next week, about his shifts, about possibly enrolling in a short course to change careers. These plans weren't glamorous, but they were real. And in them, I saw a new respect for the value of labor, the thing I had lived by my entire life but never taught with words. One afternoon, as we finished a walk, Ethan stopped by my car, hesitated for a moment, then said, "Thank you, Dad, for not leaving me." I looked at him and shook my head. "I didn't leave you," I said, "but I didn't pull you along either." He nodded. He understood. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were speaking the same language. The road back doesn't have a clear destination. There's no day marked "everything is okay now." But in those slow steps, in the silences that are no longer heavy, I can see our father-son relationship being rebuilt in a different way, with fewer illusions, fewer demands, and perhaps far more solid than what we once thought was enough. I never recovered all the money that was lost. Some of it was reclaimed after the lawsuit. Some of it wasn't. There were amounts that vanished forever, as if they had never existed. The law has its limits, and reality doesn't care how hard you worked to earn something. When I signed the final papers with the lawyer, I didn't feel relief, and I didn't feel bitterness either. I just felt tired, a deep, heavy tiredness, but no longer panic. Strangely, I didn't feel like I had lost. I still live in the same familiar house. I still go for walks every afternoon. I still make coffee every morning, listen to the radio, and read the newspaper. My life didn't return to what it was, but it also didn't collapse the way I once feared. What I regained wasn't in the numbers. It was in the boundaries I had been afraid to draw for many years. I learned how to say no, even to my own son, not with anger, but with clarity. I no longer feel the need to prove my love through unconditional sacrifice. I understand now that love without boundaries isn't love. It's the abandonment of oneself. And in holding on to those boundaries, I found the dignity I had unknowingly set aside when I allowed others to decide things for me. Ethan didn't return to who he used to be either. He didn't become successful by the standards he once chased, but he became steadier. He no longer looks for shortcuts. He no longer believes he deserves everything simply because he wants it. He works. He pays off small debts one by one. He takes responsibility for what he did, not with grand words, but with repeated actions, day after day. And even though that path is slow, it is real. We don't talk much about the past anymore, not because it doesn't still hurt, but because we don't need it to define the present. Our father-son relationship no longer rests on dependence or unspoken expectations. It rests on a new respect, built from what was broken. Not perfect, but honest. There are evenings when I sit alone and think about everything that happened. I wonder whether I could have done something differently, whether I could have protected myself sooner, taught my son more clearly, or recognized the signs before it was too late. But then I stop. Life doesn't run on counterfactuals. It runs on the choices you make when things are no longer ideal. If there is one thing I understand more clearly than anything else, it is the true meaning of being a father. Being a father doesn't mean saving your child from pain. It means teaching them how to survive it. I didn't save Ethan from pain. I didn't erase the consequences of the decisions he made, but I gave him a chance to stand up in the real world, where every action has a cost. I don't know what the future will look like. I don't know whether Ethan will stumble again, but I do know that if it happens, I won't respond with fear or guilt. I will respond with the steadiness of someone who has learned that protecting oneself is not at odds with loving one's child. And sometimes the bravest thing a father can do is not to shield, but to stand close enough to watch his child walk through the pain on their own and learn how to live with it. If you've listened this far, then this story probably no longer belongs only to me. It has touched some corner of your life, whether you're a parent, a child, or simply someone standing at a difficult crossroads involving family and money. I'm not telling this story to teach anyone what they should do because there is no single right answer for everyone. If you were in my position, what would you do? Would you cut ties completely to protect yourself, or would you give one chance, knowing that chance comes with risk and pain? And if you were Ethan, would you have the courage to face the consequences of your actions, or would you look for another way to avoid them? I don't judge any choice. Every family has its own history, its own limits, its own wounds that outsiders can't see. The only thing I truly believe is this: you are not wrong for protecting yourself, and you are not weak for holding on to compassion. Those two things can coexist, if you are clear enough about your boundaries. If you want to share, tell me where you're listening to this story from and what time it is. Maybe you're on your way to work, in a quiet kitchen, or awake late at night the way I once was. And if you've ever had to make a difficult choice involving someone you love, I'd like to hear how you handled it. Not to argue about right or wrong, but to remind each other that in our hardest moments, we are not alone.